Hi, CSSS. Thanks for the opportunity to present. My name is Raelani, and I'll be sharing with you my master's project entitled Overwinter Soil Management Impacts to Soil Moisture, Available Nitrogen, and Crop Yield on Organic Vegetable Farms in BC. This work has been conducted through the University of British Columbia as a part of the Sustainable Agricultural Landscapes Lab under the supervision of Dr. Sean Smuckler. Today, I'll take you through the background and objectives of this study, into the design, results, and preliminary conclusions, and end with acknowledgements. The impetus for this project is to help organic vegetable growers deal with some of the challenges associated with climate change. Specifically in BC, it's predicted that overall precipitation will decrease. However, the patterns are going to change, and so that more precipitation will fall as rain instead of snow, and the frequency and intensity of these events in the spring and fall are going to increase. So we're looking at the potential of wetter shoulder seasons, which is likely to affect the ability of vegetable growers to establish cover crops. So if we take a look at this graph, the blue bars are average monthly precipitation, and the red line is average temperature for Vancouver. And the shoulder seasons, spring and fall, are represented by the shaded blue triangle or rectangles. And this is where we're expecting to see increased precipitation. And in most annual vegetable production systems, the first fields are planted out in the spring, harvested into the fall, and left to rest over the winter under a cover crop. A cover crop is planted for the express purpose of protecting or enriching the soil, not for harvest. So in our region, rye, vetch, clover, field peas are all examples of cover crop species. So prior to planting both the cash and cover crop, mechanical tillage is often required to prepare the ground. And we know that tillage can damage soil structure and cause compaction, especially when done when the soil is too wet. So wetter soils are increasing the probability of damage done to soil health, and then potentially impacting the survival of cover crops just by creating waterlogged conditions. And cover crops are the preferred method for a lot of farmers because we know that there's a lot of benefits to soil health, but there's also some challenges associated with the timing of termination and establishment, and the reliance on tillage. And then regionally, there's specific challenges in our province. So in the Lower Fraser Valley and in Delta, there are migratory waterfowl that eat the cover crops and can leave the ground bare. In the Kootenays, the fall and winter can come really fast. There's a lot of snow and low temperatures, so it's difficult to establish those cover crops before the weather changes. And so given kind of the variety of challenges associated with establishing a cover crop over the whole farm every year, every winter, producers are starting to use other techniques, one of which is the use of plastic tarps. So this is a silage tarp, and they've been increasing in popularity on vegetable farms over the last couple of years. It's non-permeable plastic, traditionally used in hay production to keep the hay from spoiling. And producers are using these to extend the season. In lieu of using a cover crop, they can cover the ground, prevent excessive erosion, and be able to access that ground earlier in the spring than they would be able to given a cover crop timeline, and then also produce later into the fall because they're not necessarily worrying about getting that cover crop established. However, we don't know how much or in what ways these tarps are impacting the soil or potentially the subsequent crops, and that's the focus of this study. So we are working to quantify the effects of overwinter tarping on soil moisture, soil nitrogen, electrical conductivity, which I won't have time to talk about today, and then crop yields. And this is a 2-year study, and we're in the throes of year 2 at the moment. I'll just be sharing with you the data from the first year. So with these objectives in mind, we designed a field study incorporating data from 14 organic vegetable farms across the province. So this study is organized as a mother-daughter farm site project. So in the experimental trial, we have 2 mother farms the UBC farm in the Lower Fraser Valley and Greenfire Farm on Vancouver Island, each of which host randomly assigned plots of tarps and cover crops, 16 of each. And we laid the tarps, applied these overwinter treatments in the fall of 2019. And at UBC Farm, we were actually able to track soil moisture and soil temperature every 2 weeks over the course of the winter. But then we returned in the spring to both farms, collected soil samples, and measured soil moisture at the time of tarp removal, and then came back again in the fall to measure yield. On the complementary regional farms, we're working with 3 different areas. We have the Lower Fraser Valley, Vancouver Island, and Kootenay Mountains, which are all represented here on this map. And in these farms, on these farms, we have just one tarped and one untarped plot each. And only about half the farms were able to successfully establish a cover crop due to some of those challenges I talked about earlier. And so we consider this an untarped versus tarped comparison versus cover cropped versus tarped, like in the experimental farms. And here we laid the tarps at the same time in the fall of 2019 and then returned in the spring of 2020 to collect soil and moisture samples at the time of tarp removal. And let's just hop right into the data here. This is showing the soil moisture and soil temperature data from UBC Farm that we collected from November of 2019 when the tarps were laid down. And this vertical line indicates the time of tarp installation, and our second vertical line is the time of tarp removal. So for all the graphs, you'll see the green circles represent cover cropped or untarped plots, and then the black triangles are the tarped plots. And the error bars are standard error from the mean. On this plot, we have the dashed lines indicating soil moisture, and then these solid lines are soil temperature. So we can see that when we started, volumetric water content, soil moisture was essentially the same. And then over a couple of weeks, and then throughout the winter, the tarped plots did remain drier. However, then there in kind of early spring, we have our lines crossing, and so the cover cropped areas became drier and stayed drier until we pulled those tarps off. And when we look at soil temperature overall, we don't see much difference between the overwinter treatments. And in the spring, when soil temperature starts to increase, it's likely that the cover cropped plots had an opportunity to dry out, while the tarps trapped the soil moisture and prevented evaporation, keeping them wetter. And that data from UBC Farm helps us theorize about the results from the regional trial. So here we have 2 regions, no information from Kootenay Mountains here because of the COVID-19 travel restrictions in place at this time. And then volumetric water content along the y-axis. And we see here that the tarped plots were indeed wetter than the untarped plots at the time of tarp removal in mid to late April as well. And this is important management information because this data indicates that the tarps may have to be removed earlier in the spring if a lower soil moisture content is desired. So we next looked at nitrate at the time of tarp removal. So nitrate is an important plant available form of nitrogen, and it's highly susceptible to leaching, which made it pertinent to our study. And here we have nitrate from the experimental trial, so UBC Farm and Greenfire Farm. And in both cases, the tarped plots had significantly higher concentrations of nitrate in the spring of 2020, which supports the idea that these tarps protected the nitrate ions from leaching in the winter rains. And we saw a really similar trend on the regional trials. So in each region, the tarped plots did have higher measures of nitrate than the untarped plots. And then we looked at yield on the experimental farms. And here we have UBC Farm on the left and Greenfire Farm on the right. And we can see that for each crop type, and there were 3 crop types grown in each plot, there isn't a difference in yield, depending on the overwinter cover cropping or tarping treatment. And there's a lot of different ways that you could think about measuring yield, or you could think about using these tarps that certainly one could presume would have an impact on yield, incorporating some sort of measure of labor or time, or thinking about the absence of organic matter inputs in a tarping system. But that's not represented here. And so in the study, we're not seeing a difference in yield. So to sum up what we just saw, we found soil moisture was greater under the tarps in the spring. However, at UBC Farm, we saw the story was a little bit more complicated, and that over the winter, the tarp plots were remaining drier, and that there's an important management window in the spring when we're managing for soil moisture with these tarps. Nitrate concentrations were greater in the tarped plots compared to the untarped plots, and we didn't observe a difference in crop yield. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone involved in the success of this project, participating farmers, project supervisors, lab mates, regional collaborators, committee members. Thanks for all of your support during, especially considering this research has been conducted primarily during the pandemic. And a big thank you to our funders, the BC Climate Action Initiative. This project is a part of the Farm Adaptation Innovator Program. And many thanks to y'all for listening.